The dense gray morning mist of late 1944 hung over the jagged silhouettes of the Ardennes forest like a cold, wet shroud clinging to the woolen uniforms of the American infantrymen who shivered in their foxholes. Across the valley within the command bunkers of the German 5th Panzer Army, officers of the Wehrmacht were meticulously finalizing the tactical plans for Operation Herbstennebel, the massive winter counteroffensive designed to split the Allied lines and seize the port of Antwerp. The German commanders, from the veteran colonels to the aristocratic generals of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, operated within a military culture defined by centuries of Prussian tradition and a rigid yet sophisticated doctrine of mission-type orders known as Auftragstaktik. This doctrine, which allowed junior leaders to exercise initiative within a clear strategic intent, was considered the pinnacle of military professionalization. However, as the German intelligence officers analyzed their previous encounters with the United States Army in the hedgerows of Normandy and the plains of Lorraine, they were confronted with a tactical phenomenon that they found entirely inexplicable. They could not understand how American small units consisting of a dozen men led by a mere sergeant could continue to fight with aggressive coordinated lethality long after their senior officers had been killed and their radio communications had been severed. To the German mind, which valued the visible presence of a decisive commander and a clear hierarchical rhythm of command, the American style of decentralized warfare appeared not as a doctrine but as a chaotic and unpredictable series of individualistic outbursts that somehow resulted in tactical victory. The fundamental reason for this German confusion lay in a deep cultural and institutional misunderstanding of the American citizen soldier and the specific evolution of the United States Army's field manuals. For the German officer, the art of war was a sacred profession requiring years of specialized schooling and a strict adherence to the cult of leadership or Führerprinzip. Even their own initiative-based system, Auftragstaktik, relied on the assumption that the subordinate leader was a professional soldier with a deep grasp of higher-level operational theory. When they looked at the American Army, they saw what they derisively termed a collection of amateurs. They saw grocery clerks, farmers, mechanics, and students who had been hastily trained in the training camps of Georgia and Kansas and then shipped across the Atlantic. German intelligence reports from 1943 and early 1944 frequently characterized the American soldier as being overly dependent on material superiority and lacking the martial spirit required for close-quarters combat. They assumed that if they could kill the American officers and disrupt the logistical chain, the American infantry would simply collapse into a disorganized mob. But as the fighting moved from the beaches of Normandy into the dense interior of the European continent, the Germans began to realize that the American mob possessed a strange, invisible, cohesive strength that defied their standard military logic. The secret weapon of the American military was the non-commissioned officer, the sergeant, who functioned as the primary catalyst for small unit action. While the German army also possessed highly capable NCOs, their role was primarily to enforce discipline and execute the precise orders of the officer class. In the American Army, by contrast, the squad leader and the platoon sergeant were granted a level of tactical autonomy that was unique among the major powers of the Second World War. This was not the result of a single grand decree but rather a pragmatic adaptation to the realities of industrial warfare. The American military realized early on that in the chaos of a modern battlefield characterized by high explosive artillery and rapid-fire machine guns, the ability of a central commander to direct every movement was a myth. Therefore, the training of the American infantrymen was centered on the concept of the squad as a self-contained problem-solving unit. A 12-man American squad was not just a collection of riflemen but a modular team built around the firepower of the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle and the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR. The squad was trained to recognize a tactical problem such as a concealed German machine gun nest and solve it without waiting for a formal order from a captain or a colonel. This decentralized problem-solving mindset was a direct reflection of the American democratic society from which these soldiers were drawn. The United States in the 1930s and 1940s was a culture that celebrated individualism, pragmatism, and the ability to fix machines. This national character translated directly into the foxhole. When an American squad found its radio lines cut and its lieutenant dead, the sergeant did not wait for a messenger to arrive with new instructions. He analyzed the terrain, he identified the enemy's weak point, and he directed his men to flank and destroy the opposition. To a German observer watching through binoculars from a distant ridge, this looked like a total breakdown of military order. They saw soldiers moving in small disjointed groups without the traditional formations of a disciplined assault. They saw what appeared to be a lack of direction. But what they were actually witnessing was the highest form of tactical flexibility, the ability of a small unit to operate as an independent entity based on a shared understanding of the immediate objective. The Germans could not explain this because they were looking for a commander to issue a command when the command had already been internalized by the men at the lowest level of the hierarchy. The mechanics of the American infantry squad's combat drills further complicated the German assessment. The American Field Manual FM 100-5 emphasized the principle of fire and maneuver, which at the squad level became a sophisticated dance of suppression and flanking. While one half of the squad utilized their semi-automatic M1 Garand to pin down the German defenders with a volume of fire that far exceeded what a comparable German unit armed with bolt-action Karabiner 98 rifles could produce, the other half of the squad would crawl through the brush to gain a position from which they could use grenades and close-quarters fire to finish the job. This required a high degree of trust and communication between individual soldiers. The Germans often noted in their post-combat reports that American infantry seemed to possess a sixth sense for coordinating their fire without visible signals. This invisible coordination was actually the result of thousands of hours of repetitive training in the United States and England, where squad leaders were taught to read the flow of battle and adjust their tactics on the fly. The German command structure, which was designed to push orders from the top down, found itself constantly reacting to an enemy that was pushing decisions from the bottom up. The role of technology also played a significant part in this decentralized fighting style. The United States was the most mechanized and radio-dense army in the world. The widespread deployment of the SCR-536 handy-talkie and the SCR-300 walkie-talkie allowed even small units to maintain a level of horizontal communication that was unprecedented. However, even when these radios failed, the American doctrine of the squad leader taking the initiative remained intact. German intelligence units specialized in eavesdropping on American radio traffic were often confused by the informal and seemingly undisciplined language used by American troops. They heard sergeants and corporals discussing tactical decisions using slang and nicknames, often sounding more like workers on a construction site than soldiers in a life or death struggle. The Germans interpreted this as a lack of professional military bearing, failing to understand that this informality was actually a highly efficient method of rapid communication that allowed for the quick dissemination of complex ideas in the heat of combat. As the war entered the harsh winter of 1944, the Germans attempted to exploit the perceived American weakness of decentralized command during the Battle of the Bulge. They believed that by creating a massive chaotic breakthrough, they could induce a total panic in the American rear and cause the entire command structure to disintegrate. They deployed specialized units of English-speaking saboteurs behind American lines under the command of Otto Skorzeny to cut telephone wires and flip road signs, hoping to paralyze the American decision-making process. For a few days, the plan seemed to work as chaos reigned in the higher headquarters. But then the German offensive ran into the unforeseen obstacle of the American small unit initiative. At dozens of isolated crossroads and tiny Belgian villages, small groups of American soldiers who had been cut off from their parent units did something the German planners had never accounted for. They stopped, they organized themselves, and they fought. At places like Bastogne and St. Vith, the German columns were delayed not by a massive coordinated counteroffensive from General Eisenhower, but by the stubborn independent actions of individual squads and platoons who decided on their own that they would not retreat. A German colonel who was part of the 6th Panzer Army later recounted his frustration at trying to capture a vital bridge held by a single platoon of American engineers. He noted that even after his artillery had pounded the American position and his tanks had moved in to finish the survivors, the Americans continued to fight from the rubble. He described how every time he thought the American resistance had been decapitated, a new leader would emerge from the ruins to direct the fire. He could not find the head of the snake because in the American army every sergeant was a potential head. This was the brutal reality that the German high command could never fully reconcile with their own theories of warfare. They had built a military machine that was a masterpiece of vertical integration and professional hierarchy, but they were fighting a society that had built a military machine based on horizontal resilience and localized problem solving. The German generals could explain the movements of American divisions and the logistics of the American Air Force, but they could never truly explain why a 20-year-old corporal from Ohio would continue to hold a muddy ditch against a Tiger tank after every officer in his chain of command had been silenced. The inability of the Germans to grasp this concept was also a reflection of the differing objectives of their military training. The Wehrmacht trained its men to be part of a grand historical struggle for the state where their individual identity was subsumed by the needs of the Volk. The United States Army trained its men to win the war so they could go home and resume their lives as private citizens. This pragmatic goal-oriented focus meant that the American soldier was not interested in the aesthetics of a perfectly executed military maneuver. He was interested in what worked. If a tactical problem could be solved by calling in an overwhelming amount of artillery or by using a bulldozer to bury a bunker, he would do it without hesitation. The Germans often complained that the Americans fought unfairly or that they were cowards who relied on machines instead of bravery. This was a classic defensive psychological reaction to the fact that the Americans were fundamentally redefining the nature of combat. The American squad was a tool of industrial efficiency applied to the messy reality of the battlefield, and its lack of traditional military order was not a flaw but its greatest strength. The German intelligence service Fremdheere West, which was responsible for analyzing the Allied armies, spent much of the war trying to categorize and predict American behavior. They produced thousands of pages of detailed reports on the organization of American divisions and the technical specs of American equipment. But their analysis of American psychology and command culture remained remarkably thin and filled with contradictions. They frequently oscillated between describing the Americans as soft and easily broken and describing them as tenacious and unpredictably aggressive. This inconsistency was a symptom of their failed paradigm. They were trying to measure a decentralized system using a centralized yardstick. They looked for the telltale signs of a coming offensive: the massing of command tents, the specific radio frequencies associated with the divisional headquarters, and the presence of high-ranking officers at the front. But the Americans often launched their most effective local attacks based on the observation of a single scout or the initiative of a platoon leader who saw an opportunity and took it. Furthermore, the American logistical system supported this decentralization by providing small units with an abundance of supplies. A U.S. squad rarely had to wait for permission to use its ammunition or its medical supplies. They operated with a sense of plenty that stood in stark contrast to the scarcity that plagued the late-war German army. This material abundance allowed American small unit leaders to be more aggressive because they knew that the cost of an initial failure could be absorbed by the system. If a squad failed to take a hill on the first attempt, they didn't have to wait for a long chain of bureaucratic approvals to try again. They simply regrouped, replenished their ammunition, and formulated a new plan on the spot. To the German soldiers, who were often surviving on horse meat and a handful of rifle rounds, the American way of war looked less like a military operation and more like a relentless factory production line that just happened to be moving through the forest. In post-war interrogations, many German generals expressed a profound respect for the American NCO and the resilience of the American small unit. They admitted that the Americans were far more flexible and innovative than they had initially believed. They spoke of the American ability to improvise solutions as the primary reason why the German defense was constantly being unhinged. Whether it was the creation of the Rhino tanks with their hedgerow cutters in Normandy or the rapid repair of damaged bridges by combat engineers under fire, the American Army demonstrated a level of bottom-up engineering that the German military structure could not replicate. The Germans had the finest tanks and some of the most sophisticated weapons of the war, but they were operating within a system that was increasingly rigid and disconnected from the realities of the front line. The Americans conversely had a system that was messy and often disorganized, but it was fundamentally connected to the initiative and the will of the individual soldier. The ultimate failure of the German explanation for American tactics was a failure to recognize the power of the citizen soldier in a total war. The Germans had mastered the art of professional warfare, but the Americans had mastered the art of mobilizing a modern society for a singular purpose. The decentralized command structure of the American squad was not a sign of weakness or a lack of discipline. It was the natural expression of a society that valued results over process and a military that understood that in the chaos of modern combat, the man on the ground with the rifle is the only one who truly knows what needs to be done. The invisible orders that the Germans could never find were not written on paper or transmitted over the radio. They were the shared values and the common sense of 12 men in a muddy forest who decided together that they would keep moving forward until the job was finished. This remains the defining characteristic of the American military in the European theater, a resilience built not on the strength of a single leader but on the collective initiative of a million individuals whose actions could never be captured by a German intelligence report or explained by a Prussian military manual. The legacy of this tactical disparity continued to shape military theory for decades after the war. The American experience in Europe proved that the most effective way to manage the complexity of the modern battlefield is to push authority down to the lowest possible level. This realization led to the modern concept of mission command, which has become the standard for the U.S. Army and many of its allies. The Germans, who had pioneered the early versions of this idea, found themselves defeated by an enemy that took the concept to its logical extreme and applied it with the weight of an entire industrial civilization. The story of why the Germans could not explain how U.S. squads fought without orders is ultimately a story of the collision between two different worlds. One world was defined by the ancient hierarchies of the European past, and the other by the pragmatic, decentralized future of the American present. In the forests of the Ardennes and the ruins of Germany, it was the future that ultimately prevailed. As the final shots of the war in Europe were fired in May 1945, the German military had been completely dismantled. Thousands of German officers sat in prisoner of war camps, reflecting on the collapse of their world and the unexpected tenacity of their conquerors. They looked back at the battles they had lost and the American units that had repeatedly outmaneuvered them, still searching for the hidden logic of the American command. They searched for the grand strategic masterstrokes that had led to their defeat, failing to realize that the war had been won in 10,000 small engagements that were never recorded in a general's journal. It had been won by the sergeant who took the initiative to clear a sniper from a bell tower, the corporal who found a path through a minefield, and the private who kept his machine gun firing long after his position had been bypassed. The invisible orders were nothing more than the individual decisions of millions of men who were given the freedom to think for themselves and the responsibility to act for their brothers. This was a reality that no German general could ever truly explain, because it was a reality that could only exist in an army of free men. The enduring image of the American infantryman in World War II is often one of a rugged, unpretentious man leaning against a jeep or sharing a cigarette in a ruined doorway. Behind this casual exterior, however, was a sophisticated tactical mind that had been honed by a training system that prioritized adaptation over blind obedience. The German army, for all its brilliance, was a system designed to perfect the past, while the American army was a system designed to survive the present and engineer the future. The Germans couldn't explain how American squads fought without orders because they couldn't imagine a military where the most important orders were the ones the soldiers gave to themselves. This tactical independence ensured that the American army remained an agile and lethal force even when its formal structures were under the most intense pressure. It allowed the United States to absorb the initial shocks of combat and grow into an unstoppable juggernaut that could project power across an entire continent. In the end, the German inability to understand American decentralized command was a fatal strategic error. It led them to underestimate the resilience of the American front lines and to design offensive operations that were too fragile to survive the determined resistance of isolated small units. By focusing on the head of the command structure, they missed the strength that was distributed throughout the entire body of the American army. They fought a war against a hierarchy when they should have been fighting a war against a network. The American squad leader, with his maps, his radio, and his 12 men, was a node in a massive decentralized system of destruction that the German military tradition simply did not have the tools to analyze or defeat. The silence of the German intelligence reports on this subject is perhaps the greatest testament to the effectiveness of the American small unit. It was a force so revolutionary and so fundamentally different from everything that had come before that the best military minds of the Third Reich could only watch in silent confusion as it dismantled their empire one foxhole at a time. The historical records from the final months of the war are filled with accounts of German units surrendering to American formations that were operating far in advance of their support lines. These German commanders often expressed shock when they realized they were surrendering to a junior officer or a senior NCO whose unit had been operating on its own initiative for days. They looked for the massive logistical columns and the elaborate headquarters that they associated with a successful offensive, and found only a few dusty Shermans and a company of tired infantrymen who were already planning their next move. This disconnect between expectation and reality was the ultimate manifestation of the German misunderstanding of the American way of war. They could not conceive of a victory that was not managed from a central point of control, and yet they were being defeated by a victory that was being manufactured at the front line by the very men who were doing the fighting. This decentralized lethality was not just a product of training but also of the American experience with the Great Depression. The men who fought in World War II had grown up in a time of severe hardship that required constant improvisation and the ability to make do with whatever was at hand. This lived experience made them naturally inclined to look for practical solutions to immediate problems. When they entered the army, they brought this mindset with them. They viewed a military obstacle not as a test of their devotion to the state but as a practical problem to be solved so they could move on to the next task. This psychological resilience was the foundation upon which the American Small Unit Initiative was built. It gave the American soldier the confidence to act on his own judgment even when the situation was dire. The Germans, whose training was designed to produce a specific type of soldier who fit into a specific type of system, were ill-equipped to deal with an adversary who was constantly changing the rules and acting outside the established norms of military behavior. The final synthesis of why the Germans could not explain the American style of combat comes down to the difference between a military that is a machine and a military that is a community. The German army was a machine of incredible power, but a machine is only as good as its operators and its internal components. When the operators were killed and the components were damaged, the machine stopped working. The American army, however, was a community of soldiers who shared a common goal and a common set of practical skills. Because they were a community, they could rearrange themselves and find new leaders and new ways to fight whenever the situation changed. They were not dependent on a central brain to function. They were a collective intelligence that was distributed throughout the entire organization. This organic resilience was the ultimate secret weapon of the United States in Europe. It allowed the Americans to endure the most brutal conditions and the most determined counterattacks and to emerge victorious in a war that the German High Command believed they had every right to win. The invisible fire and the invisible orders were the same thing: the collective will and the individual initiative of the American citizen soldier.